Hi, let me welcome all of you into my home this fall semester 2021. If I post this to future classes as a point of reference, let me welcome you as well. Now, as students in a Texas history class, surely you're aware that we're engaged in a culture war that's openly politicized our state's history. We have progressive scholars on one side and traditionalists on the other, which also includes research scholars doing narrative history. Most of you are going to become educators, and I don't want any of you walking into your first PTA meeting feeling like a dog that wandered on the freeway. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to size up the situation that's revving up our culture war, and then I'm going to handicap the two sides like we're betting on a big shootout. I'll go down the list of their attributes and their debilities, and we'll see why traditional history seems to be looking like the winner at the moment and why. It'll be clear by then what both sides need to do if we're going to move toward a new usable past. So if you're wondering what's going on in Texas and American society, let me tell you folks, I've been thinking about what's led us to this point since most of you are in elementary school. So it's not like I didn't see it coming. I wrote a book, Lone Star Mine, which went to press in 2017 that anticipated this moment in time before our cultural differences blew up into what we're seeing today. I believe it's worth mentioning that the word count for the endnotes and bibliography is about equal to the narrative itself. I didn't say that to impress you, but to tee up a point worth emphasizing. About a third of the books that I cited have zero to do with Texas history directly, but they have everything to do with understanding Texas history intellectually, particularly at this moment in time. What you'll see is that conceptually and philosophically, we as scholars have been slow to get ahead of events by finding new ways to understand and explain the past, and they are out there. Now, something I want you to keep in mind as we move forward. In Texas history, our leading scholars said back in 1991 that the traditional history was so weak it would soon wither into folklore. So I have a question. If traditional history was so weak, why is it not only alive but thriving? Well, now, scratch that. Let me twist the question so we can come at it from another direction. It's more revealing of what we really do in the academy. If scholarship is so good, why can't it kill off a fairy tale that had one foot in the grave and one foot on a banana peel 30 years ago? The answer has many layers, and you'll see that we as progressive historians are mostly to blame for this big standoff who has everyone fighting over perhaps the weightiest question of our time, who owns the past? Spoiler alert, guys, we all own the past, and each from our own worldviews. That might sound contradictory, but you'll understand perfectly by the time we're through. Remember the third of those books that have nothing to do directly with Texas history? Well, they make clear, to me at least, that our issues are not irreconcilable. But first, we have to be willing to let go of some old ideological attitudes that stand between scholarship and a new usable past, one that rolls into it the redeeming elements of the traditional worldview. One that, let me repeat that, one that rolls into redeeming elements of the traditional worldview. Now, if you're muttering what redeeming elements, then you've already pinpointed one of our problems, guys. Check this out. I want you to think about the book's epigraph, that is the quotation that comes before the table of contents. There's a reason why it has its home page. But anyway, here's the book, and this epigraph here, it says, a man who tells his own story is always right until the adversary's tale is told. The guy that said that was Sam Houston, the namesake of our school. Kind of sums up the situation we're in too, don't you think? We've got two stories now, and neither one of them looks like they're going away on their own. So the challenge before us then is, how do we reconcile them? And despite what either side is saying about the other, they are reconcilable. Let me piggyback on Big Sam and give you one of my silly analogies to help you understand why it's possible to get there, guys. Think of a couple of old classic cars sitting out in the field somewhere. You got your pre-war jalopy with metal about that thick that's over 80 years old, then some kind of muscle car from the 1960s that some wacky racer wrapped around a telephone pole. It's over 50 years old now. So they both need to be restored, which means sandblasting them down to the bare metal. That's code for unchecked criticism by me. But there's only enough parts for one car, and we got to figure out how to make it roll out of the barn. And that's what I'm doing, people. Back in the real world, that doesn't mean watering down a new usable past with cowboys and Indians history. What it does mean is that if the narratives we write fail to contemplate the experience of Anglo males, their self-interest, and their worldviews, they'll be just as big a whoppers as the great white lie that we continually condemn. End of story. That said, what are the stakes in this culture war? I mean, is Texas history really that important in the big scheme of things? I mean, American history is this big, right? And world history, my gosh, my arms aren't long enough. My colleagues, my gosh, they write about the rise and fall of empires, and pretty sure by comparison, they envision me telling you guys that our story is like I'm sitting on a Cracker Barrel at the general store. But let me tell you this, our history does not end when the old frontier closed. And I would contend that anyone who says that they're going to produce some sweeping account of American history without considering how the emergence of modern Texas and the Texan mind have influenced their topic will be unable to make full sense of the way contemporary America is truly developing. Don't try to memorize this, guys, but my gosh, folks, we got 3 cities among the nation's 10 largest, and they're composed of virtually every ethnicity, culture, and religion. Even so, at a time when the Black Lives Matter movement has most of the country thinking about this sudden resurgence of mass civil rights protests as mostly a black and white thing, our Tejano population gives us an embedded triracial historical identity, which is kind of important now that Hispanics have become America's largest minority group. Then there are the Supreme Court cases that originated in Texas. They've contoured our social landscape in so many ways. Guys, they range from matters of race, class, and gender, and the limits of free expression when God burned the flag, to gun control and the reproductive rights of women, which you'll see is in the news again. Then consider that since World War II, Texas has produced 4 presidents by my count, and the list goes on. I mean, my gosh, the weight we swung around in Washington, D.C. can be measured not only by the military bases and the huge projects like dams and intercoastal waterway, but also by NASA, the aerospace industry, and then there's all the high-tech and medical research facilities. And seems like I'm forgetting something. Oh yeah, an oil and gas industry that's as heavily subsidized as it is lightly regulated. How do you think it got that way, guys? Anyway, the list goes on. But for this reason, I was telling my students to forget the Alamo long before all these other Poindexters were trying to forget it. You realize it's a thing, right? Forgetting the Alamo? I'm being dramatic to make a point, folks. Forgive me. My reason was that if you want to explain how all of you got into this section of Texas history in a university that was founded for the education of white Texans exclusively, the Alamo has little material value. What we as researchers tend to minimize is that for many of you, the Alamo explains who you are. For traditionalists, it feeds the zeitgeist, that is the core spirit of Texas exceptionalism, which I want to acknowledge. I could talk about that until Santa Ana's nephews come home, but that's all I'm going to say about that, because it's going to distract us from things I want you to wrap your minds around today. So let's get back to the material importance of Texas history and save the ethereal matters for another day. Because of this moment in time, there's also something else at stake, because we're in the middle of a side contest that factors in who we will become as American citizens. You guys should have enough cultural literacy to be familiar with the concept of yin and yang. Well, as the country's largest blue state, California, in effect, represents the progressive yin to Texas's conservative yang in a contest of competing systems and philosophies that involve concepts of wealth accumulation, influence peddling, business regulation, all the basic rules of power that shape society. So yeah, Texas history is kind of important. There's a lot at stake as our two sides here at home, traditionalists and progressives, continue to grapple over exclusive ownership of our Texan past. Many of you have probably chosen a side to be on, and some of you even have passionate beliefs. I know a lot of you have bigger things going on that when you're trying to work your way through school, things kind of prioritize themselves for you. But I'm sure that I'm going to be talking about some philosophical issues that amp some of you up. But before I do that, let me give you the lay of land of our cultural landscape as I saw it taking shape when I wrote the book at a time when Texas history was not a wide open political football. To me, there were 2 things coming into view that are responsible for all the turmoil in our Texan lives today. Now, I want you to think about this deeply. One of them's happened only 3 times since Leander Lucy was dragging those hairy knuckles along where I-35 almost paved over 13,000 years later, and it's getting synergy with something that has never happened. Let me let that sink in for a minute. You can disagree with my big picture here, but hopefully it doesn't leave too much room for getting all emotional. But you guys know what synergy is, by the way? It's when 1 + 1 = 3. That should make perfect sense, I'm sure. But really, if you think of Texas history in epochs, so I mean, we're going through an epochal transition, guys. I mean, the first epoch began when First Nations had only nature and each other to contend with. And once Europeans arrived, a contest of empires ensued, in which Spaniards and Comanches eventually settled into a violent coexistence. Then we pivoted to a third age where Anglo-males achieved ascendancy. And now this is important. Don't think of these men as Southerners, nor Americans, or even Texians, but Anglo men. Viewed through this lens, the present epoch appears to be running its course grudgingly as we transition into a fourth era whose identity and values are going to be defined in part by this very moment in time and how the winners and losers respond as democracy. The emerging post-Christian age, something entirely without precedent. That's the other thing, the emerging post-Christian age. And there's your catalyst, guys. Before you start bouncing around the room like Daffy Duck, though, let me make it clear. It's kind of a misnomer, especially at an emotional level. It doesn't mean that Christianity is hemorrhaging followers, nor that our sense of spirituality as a people is waning. It just means that we're moving into an age where everyone counts and on their own terms, which is actually so profound that it's truly an epochal phenomenon, guys. So plainly, whether it's the church or other institutions of authority, they're losing ability to pressure society into conforming to traditional behavioral standards. You factor into that the proposal here recently to make the Holy Bible the state book of Texas. My gosh, a few weeks ago, by the time some of you read this, or soon by the time some of you hear this lecture, maybe we'll get to see whether we have a new official book that we can read. If not, not this, it's going to be some other issue that keeps Texas identity in the public consciousness. Regardless, whatever new national climate settles in on the other side of this culture war, more and more Americans, including Texans, will be increasingly seeking their values and identities in places beyond conventional customs and mores. Let me tell you something you need to understand. Some of you might not like this, but directly ahead of us lies a new age that is unavoidable, where the limits of the global frontier, the environment, and American imperialism are already in view. To continue seeking an identity and values in a 19th century frontier ethos that was propped up by rugged individualism, social Darwinism, manifest destiny, and similar traditions of American ideology does not work like it used to. Not reconciling these realities is among the things keeping us apart in this culture war. The bottom line, guys, we're evolving as a society. Or if you don't buy into that, let's say we're transmogrifying into some kind of Texan Quasimodo. But I mean, either way, guys, it demands a new story that's relevant to all Texans on both sides of our culture war. That brings us to one of the assignments you had. I asked y'all to watch a couple of videos from the series Unmakers of Texas History, produced by Michelle Haas, who is editor of Copano Bay Press that turns out works of popular culture. And you know, I've read some of their books and found them enjoyable. Now, I don't believe they're going to draw the attention of the Pulitzer Prize Committee, but you know, that's not their intention. I mean, don't get me wrong. Some of these books are worthy of being reviewed in scholarly journals, but most of them are simply meant to be enjoyed. Individually, they might not make much of an impact on the way we view Texas history, but collectively, they do carry some intellectual weight that scholars don't seem to appreciate fully. As for the videos, I watched them myself, and I'm sure if you saw them, you probably know the delivery was kind of off-putting and combative. It was distracting and difficult to listen to, but guys, I hung in there and I took her complaints seriously. Even briefly, very briefly, when she flashed my picture in the dust jacket from my book up there as she was saying some unflattering things. But guys, yeah, it didn't really matter because it was Walter Binger she made her lightning rod. Boy, did she throw some hot bolts at him or what? You know, I've known Walter, though, since before most of you were alive. And you know, he's the leading intellectual historian in our field. I mean, he's the director of the Texas State Historical Association. He has, you know, a couple of different endowed chairs, but He also has an incredibly demanding job that doesn't pay nearly as well as the private sector. He's also a friend. Again, my editor enlisted Walter as a reader for Lone Star Mind, and I've given him feedback for manuscripts he's produced. That doesn't mean we march in lockstep. In fact, I have a couple of fundamental disagreements with him over his reluctance to let go of some postmodern attitudes that he's embraced for as long as I've known him. If you think Miss Haas went after Walter, wait till I have my turn with him. But the difference, though, guys, is there's nothing I'm going to say that Walter hasn't already read and then criticized himself. So, we don't go after anyone personally. As scholars, we sling a lot of red ink at each other because that's what we do. It's called intellectual inquiry. We welcome criticism. It tightens our work and it makes us better scholars. So in the spirit of intellectual inquiry, I'm going to take the criticisms of Ms. Haas seriously. I don't know her personally, but I put a human face on Walter. Let me refer to her as Michelle to remind you guys that these are real people. The most ironic thing in the world is that they both like Texas history. It's priceless, right? I mean, there's so much ideological polarization right now. It's easy to lose sight of that fact. You think one of them would pick up the phone. I mean, they're both in the book. But anyway, if you strip away the personal attacks, so Michelle makes some valid points that deserve a full, sincere response. But it was something she said in her closer that, for me, brought the whole Megillah into focus. She went like this. She goes, since the cloistered academics won't come out since the cloistered academics won't come out and compete in the marketplace of ideas to debate and discuss history, an us versus them situation has emerged. What a loaded comment, guys. Geesh. I mean, first of all, academia is the marketplace of ideas. Pretty much all we do is debate and discuss history. Well, unfortunately, though, there hasn't been any room at the end for traditional history since in Texas for about 1990, and so her complaint is entirely legitimate. It's mostly our fault as scholars, and it's a situation that has contributed mightily to this impasse that's stirring everyone up. As scholars, though, here's where we screwed up. To expect believers of traditional Texas history like Michelle to abandon a narrative that places their lives and their ways and values in a historical perspective without a clear, thorough, and convincing alternative is absurd. I mean, but that's where we are, and again, needlessly so. Admittedly, as scholars, we've done a lousy job of communicating with the general public about the way we research, process, and write Texas history. And we've compounded it by ignoring works that don't follow a scholarly trope or basically the rhetorical style that comes with our territory. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander in our case. I mean, from a postmodern perspective that progressive Texas historians embrace, Michelle's version of Texas history is correct from her point of view. We can't have it both ways. It's all part of the sausage we produce in the academy. Postmodernism notwithstanding, I believe historians should try to look at the past with detached objectivity, especially in these volatile times. For the handful of you who are into postmodernism, it seems like there's always a couple in every class. You guys know who you are. But let me clue you in. We're into cultural history now, which inclines toward rejecting the basic negativism of postmodern ideology. It concerns itself more with practical matters rather than jumping through ideological hoops that have become counterproductive. Guys, I don't know if all this is going to confuse you or make it easier for you to understand, but it's worth noting that postmodernism has flavored our sausage the way curry flavors Indian food, or perhaps it'd be more accurate if I say the way chili peppers flavor Tex-Mex food, right? Anyway, postmodernism's influence on American scholarship is so endemic, and it both acknowledges traditional history and dismisses it in the same hypothesis. Postmodernism takes for granted that there can be no absolute truths. Therefore, it logically follows that the intellectual arc driving their narrative is merely the product of power and the force of language. So, while grossly oversimplified, we've taken the attitude that the core of traditional history, it's just an artificial construct that possesses only relative validity, and so we can just dismiss it out of hand. Matter of fact, we can just dismiss all such sweeping hypotheses out of hand. What you have to appreciate, though, is that scholars were fighting an uphill battle. And part of that rhetorical fight was attacking the narrative of traditionalists. We didn't have a grand thesis to tie all the scholarship we have produced. And we still don't, because of that postmodern attitude that one grand thesis is as good as another. So, no. But for now, hearing Michelle's wrap-up comment made me realize that perhaps she just doesn't know how we make sausage. If she did, boy, she could have really stuck it to us, because we're not conceptualizing our times and our situation in a way that we can understand it all ourselves, much less readily explain it to all a general public that wants simple answers to complex questions. So, let me give all you guys a tour of the sausage factory in a way that removes the mystery from what we do, and hopefully it'll help you understand how current events and the writing of history are coming together, and why some of us scholars and intellectuals have been slow to get ahead of the curve. Remember what Big Sam said about the adversary's tale. Let me place this into perspective for you. All of you know the old cliche, there are two sides to every story, right? As a general rule, cliches are usually written on red flags, and this one's no different. When you're talking about master narratives, there can only be one story. When you have two, it's a symptom that it's time for a new story. It's as simple as that, guys and gals. You don't have to look at it like it's a cage match. I mean, my gosh, there's enough Texas history to go around. The trouble is, neither side's talking to the other. Let me explain. Here's the way the writing history is supposed to work. You have orthodoxy, which is traditional history, and then you have antithesis, which is progressive scholarship. What you should end up with is a new orthodoxy. In other words, a new usable past. Think of that car that we're going to roll out of the barn. I mean, something capable of carrying all Texans for the smooth ride that leads to a true sense of historicity. That is, historicity means that feel of historical authenticity that makes all the tumblers in your mind fall into place. Anyway, this project's called a process. It's called a logical triad, but guys, there ain't nothing logical about real life, is there? And right now, it looks more like the deadly combination is set up for a Fire Marshal Bill skit in the express lane to a new usable Texas past, but it gives us a baseline we can go with. Talk about reaching back to the 90s. So let me show you something. In Texas, there's been one formal narrative for almost 100 years. I say formal because during the Great Depression, our centennial year was approaching. The state commissioned this committee. They got together and they decided to pursue an intellectual arc that emphasized the Texas Revolution and our Western heritage, and pushed the Civil War into the background. They wanted Big Tex to blow out all 100 candles on that birthday cake and make sure old Johnny Reb's invitation got lost in the mail. Now, J. Frank Dobie, the old school historian who Michelle admired so much, along with Walter Prescott Webb and Roy Bedichek. Well, Dobie was the lead historian on that committee, and they decided that a people in the midst of the Great Depression could use a boost. Boy, it was the boost that keeps giving, let me tell you. My book explains how it took root. It was retooled in the 1950s to fit Cold War politics, and how it eventually evolved into the zeitgeist, that is the core of Texas exceptionalism. But to put things into perspective for you, what J. Frank Dobie did was exactly the same thing Walter did when he formally began pushing that new social history. Remember the 1990 study titled Texas History and the Move into the 21st Century, the one that Michelle put in her crosshairs in that first video? Well, it was just like the Centennial Committee. I mean, Walter was the lead historian on that team, just like J. Frank Dobie was the lead historian on the Texas Centennial Committee. And kind of like the one Dobie was on, Walter's committee decided that a people in the midst of cultural change could use a boost. The boost in this case was to invest more energy in the same kind of social history that was being practiced in every reputable history department in the United States, and to treat traditional history even worse than they treated poor old Johnny Reb. It didn't take off like the previous interpretation did, and for a bunch of good reasons we'll get to when I handicap our contest. For many generations, the traditional interpretation served as a point of calibration for everyone, even those othered out of this triumphal narrative. Then, just like Sam Houston said, along comes the adversary's tale in the form of revisionists, followed by others with new constructions of the past. If we had to throw up a "you are here" sign, we'd probably be inching toward a tug of war toward that new orthodoxy. But spoiler alert, guys, as I've said, a new usable past is never going to take shape without re-envisioning and rolling into it elements of traditional Texas history. And right now, scholars don't seem interested in doing that, and not sure they particularly know how. On the other side of the coin, there are some research historians in Texas whose touchstone is traditional history. But because of their trope, again, the rhetorical style that comes along with it, they're not taken seriously. Our field has shown little curiosity in probing the mind and history of traditionalists outside of memory studies and whiteness studies, which is not the same thing. In effect, progressive scholarship has othered out traditionalists the same way traditionalists have othered out people of color and women of all ethnicities. Think of Big Sam's comment. I mean, my gosh, simply swapping out sympathies in an us versus them contest just doesn't have the ring of truth to me. So let me demonstrate a big part of the problem here, guys. Do you know what a historiography is? I'm sure all of you know what a bibliography is. That's basically the first step in putting a historiography together. From there, you group the books by subjects, and then you examine how they all relate to each other in a way that helps you understand the intellectual territory everything covers. One thing that jumped out to me was that when it comes to traditional history, you won't find it in scholarly works. Among the historiographies I used, there were a couple of go-to volumes. One of them was like American History Now. Both these books were published in 2011, by the way. It was composed of essays that American History Now, it was American historiography. It had American Revolution to the history of American capitalism. As you'd expect, there were chapters on gender, ethnicities, and class, but nothing that assessed the lowbrow culture of popular history. Then the other book was essays, it was closer to home. It's called Beyond Texas Through Time, edited by Walter Binger and Arnaldo de Leon. And it was a 20-year follow-up to the historiography Texas Through Time, published in 1991. So anyway, like American History Now, Beyond Texas Through Time addressed scholarship almost exclusively. There was no chapter on traditional history and the popular culture in that book. In practical terms, that means that about half the books produced about Texas are not even part of the conversation. I counted. Guys, nobody would expect intellectual historiographies to give much attention to unscholarly works, but it's disconcerting to see it so completely disregarded because that tipping point I mentioned, I guess I didn't really mention this tipping point. We kind of had a tipping point, where you can probably connect those dots for yourself. But anyway, it's a different fight for scholars now as we're fighting downhill, starting to fight downhill. But most of us keep swinging in the same old ways. We're willfully ignoring the traditional history distances us from understanding the traditional mind, which just as surely distances us from factoring in the politicization of history and the role of politics when we live at a time when history and politics cannot be separated from anything we do. And that's a topic I explored at length. But anyway, the popular culture does have an intellectual arc, and it has evolved in some ways scholars don't seem to appreciate fully because we spend so little time contemplating it. Contextually, it has managed to keep traditional history relevant to its enthusiasts, and it does so despite the growing canon of work discrediting it. Again, I felt like I saw everything coming and remember being taken aback by the comment of a colleague who read an early draft of my work about the time most of you were in junior high probably, when I wrote that scholars were avoiding the traditional history at their own peril. He scribbled a sarcastic comment in the margin. He goes, "What peril?" Well, if you've been keeping up with how Texas history has become political football, you'll know that the party in charge of our state right now is not only pushing a traditional brand of history with its 1836 project, but it's also openly critical of academic history. For those of you who like a good old-fashioned Texas brand, or the good old-fashioned Texas brand, your old professor here is among the enemy in this culture war simply because of what I do for a living. If you've watched the videos assigned to you, that's already well established. These are the people who issue our paychecks, fund our public universities, and protect our tenure, which allows us to sleep at night without fearing we'll be fired or harassed for what we write and present to our students. As a scholar, that seems kind of perilous to me, just saying here. But anyway, so I doubled down wherever I could in subsequent drafts and described exactly what the peril to scholarship is. It's got many layers, but near the head of the list was finding yourself in a culture war you haven't adequately prepared for. It should be plain by now, though, that there's that scholars and traditionalists, the way that they approach history and what either side wants to learn from studying the past, they're not the same. Let me demonstrate. What I'm moving is like San Jacinto is the central metaphor for Texas history, but imagine a connect the dots view of history where scholars breaking new ground have added so many unfamiliar dots, and revisionists have erased so many others that we can no longer connect them all in a way that brings a coherent picture into view. Postmodernism notwithstanding, I'm not going to stop and explain that, just go with it. They need to be reconfigured. Of course, we must place all the dots, the old along with the new, into the context of our age. And clearly, if there's a central metaphor for Texas history, it resides at San Jacinto. When you look at how the Alamo has been drawing so much attention lately, to me that says we're all missing the point. So once again, forget the Alamo, just for a minute or two, okay? As part of a phenomenon, the tug-of-war dividing not only Texans, but Americans as well, can be brought into focus by looking at the way we treat the Battle of San Jacinto. Traditionally, as winter turns into spring each year, a season of Texas independence runs its course. In the popular mind, it lasts almost 3 months, from the middle of February, when in 1836 the Alamo fell under siege, until April 21st, when the fighting abruptly ended on the marshy coastal bend of the San Jacinto River. I don't know if you heard that outside. We have a little horse and mule traffic on my street out there. Anyway, in the mind of true Texans, though, the 18-minute battle fought there birthed the Republic, consummated in the blood of martyrs who had been put to the sword or executed as pirates at San Antonio and on other battlefields in the preceding weeks. Without that brief gestation period, though, we might still remember the Alamo, but different circumstances and outcomes suggest that Texans would regard it quite differently. Let me put it this way. Back in 2000, on San Jacinto Day, April 21st, the Houston Chronicle published an editorial cartoon that encapsulated the traditional core spirit. You see the rough-cut silhouettes of this little boy. He's walking beside his father in the foreground of the San Jacinto monument to capture the solemnity of the moment. And it had the son asking his daddy an open-ended question. And the most succinct explanation for the Battle of San Jacinto is, to which his father imparted some direct conventional wisdom. He said, people who valued liberty vanquished a fellow who didn't. It was as simple as that. We vanquished Santa Anna, right? Okay. 2 decades later and more, the Chronicle has long moved on, yet too many Texans are still embracing that paternalistic explanation without giving pause to the reality of the equation. Hey, you got to admit, for a people who valued liberty while institutionalizing genocide, enslavement, and marginalization, a succinct explanation is getting a little problematic, right? But anyway, but traditionalists have it covered, kind of, which we'll get to when we talk about the assignment that takes us to Slocum. But if you incline toward traditionalism, don't get your feathers ruffled, guys, to become all defensive. I'm just explaining the situation in which we're finding ourselves right now. The utility that Texans find in San Jacinto Day, it lays bare this fundamental split in society that defines the two sides in our culture war. Among traditionalists, the battle's commemoration promotes a kind of tribal mentality grounded in a sense of Texas exceptionalism. They perceive themselves as sole heirs of the victors and regard the occasion as a proprietary event that signals their independence and self-determination. Fundamentally, then, everything that happened after that short but bloody 18-minute battle represents a record of Anglo males consolidating their gains and protecting them against all comers. While there is no San Jacinto moment for those comers left to dwell on the margins of society, as Texans of color, women of every ethnicity, and even Anglo men whose ideas, values, or associations place them at odds with the ruling order that emerged, the validating voice they have gained since the pandemic is speaking with a sense of empowerment due equals. Who knows? Perhaps our COVID experience and the murder of George Floyd will in time come to represent the San Jacinto moment for all those othered out of the traditional history. But by the way, do you know Mr. Floyd was a Texan, right? Did you see that football clip where he pulls down that pass in the end zone? And it was Jack Yates High School, baby, Houston, Texas. He was on an incredible team. I watched him play. And what's more traditional than Texas high school football, right? I mean, that should give some of you, gave me a kinship to him, that's for sure. It made me jump off this big Sam Houston orange couch behind me. But notwithstanding the possibility of this new San Jacinto moment, the sudden break with Mexico back in 1836 marks the beginning of a broad, far-flung struggle to gain the same blessings of liberty and democracy that Anglo men appropriated just like that in 18 minutes. So by co-opting the key assumption that turns on this pivotal moment in the traditional cosmos, research historians should be saying without contrivance that for present-day Texans, the true significance of San Jacinto no longer rides on the immediate outcome that gave Anglo-Texan men a clear path to hegemony. You see, from that moment forward, we have viewed the history of Texas as an effort to consolidate our gains and protect them against all comers, in traditional history at least. But now the longer view of history tells us that Texas is experiencing an epochal change where the genuine significance of the Battle of San Jacinto lies in the story of all those other are shouldered aside to trying to pursue the same blessings of liberty and freedom that Anglo men appropriated for themselves in that 18-minute battle. Just my opinion, but as we have evolved, there's a lot for white guys to be proud of in there. It took a lot of Anglo men who knew the difference between right and wrong to help make the milestones happen that people of color and all those othered out of mainstream society celebrate. Now, just talking to the white guys here, but fellas, as a democratic society, I mean, this is something to take pride in and rally around if you wanted to. In other words, it's just like Big Sam said about the adversary's tale. The challenge before traditionalists should not be how to prop up a narrative that so many Texans find offensive. It should be how to make their historical experience relevant to this new intellectual arc. That should be a shared challenge for scholars, but as Michelle suggested, it's been sitting in our inbox since about 1990. Actually, Michelle took the first step. She got my attention. Apparently, no one from the academy that I could find responded to her in print, unless it's on social media, and I don't do social media. I can barely do this thing here. So it seems consistent with what I've said about scholars dismissing traditionalists out of hand, but so there's your big picture for the moment. If I had to break this up into 2 lectures, this is where part 1 would end. But let's switch gears, and I want you to think about something. How do you reconcile a history whose purpose is to make us proud of our heritage when the other history throws cold water on it, not only by its clinical approach, but by spotlighting all the mean, nasty little messes like Slocum in your second assignment? For those of you who read the article, I bet there was one line in there that jumped out and smacked you right between the ears. Blackmail by shame. Remember that? Okay, this is an instructional story about I had a similar experience when I wrote my first book. It was a revisionist history of a big chunk of West Texas, and you've heard my lecture about Fort Griffin and the Lady Gambler Lottie Dino. Well, clueless me, I was expecting everyone out there to be fascinated. I'd set out to explore what happened during the 23 hours and 55 minutes of the day when they weren't killing each other, but there were just so many ridiculous stories of violence and folklore there that needed to be set straight. So, to my surprise, turns out the people there were a wee bit upset. Or I'll admit they were livid. Some old curmudgeon even wrote a little book about 75 pages refuting me, and there wasn't any blackmail involved, but it still echoes what the guy in Slocum said about shaming them. And this old West Texas boy, he liked his Texas history the way his father and his grandfather liked it, and the way that he thought his great-grandfather lived it. Again, he could have picked up the phone, and maybe he did. Guys, if I'm lying, I'm not. Someone out there called me and threatened to, quote, whoop your ass. And so anyway, told the guy several men have tried and most succeeded, but it ain't going to change the facts. And I don't think he was expecting that kind of response. And so, but anyway, my gosh, it all had me questioning why I wrote the book in the first place. Then something happened that I didn't expect. And here's the lesson, guys. It took a minute. But eventually the people out there came to realize that what really happened was more compelling than the fairy tale. Plus the lesson of wresting this particular land from the wilderness, the Comanches, and the farmers came with some high moral price tags. At first they reacted kind of like the folks in Slocum who got so upset about the historical marker. But again, after they simmered down, they came to realize that what was embarrassing at first actually made what happened there more important. For people who occupy the land now, it lent gravity to their own existence. And on top of everything else, it tied it into other movements in the American West that added resonance to their part of Texas. In other words, it took a while for all the tumblers to fall into place, but when they did, it gave them a new sense of historicity. Something else important, and it was gratifying to me. A reviewer remarked that it was revisionist, but that it did not project present-day values backwards. There are a couple of lessons here. That's one of them. The bigger one is that I took a place with a cherished traditional history and rewrote the entire narrative of that area, warts and all. Traditional history needs to take a similar approach, and there are narrative historians, traditionalists, who are indeed doing that without surrendering the focus on their own interests. And from their point of view, when they do that, scholars who write historiographies need to acknowledge their merits. Keep all this in mind as we continue, because I'm going to float a Texas fun fact past you here. 2036, the bicentennial of Texas independence. It's only 15 years from 2021. Do you envision us having a new usable pass by then? Or do you believe this stalemate between progressives and scholars, or between progressive scholars and traditionalists, will continue forever? Now, think about this. What do you want history to do for you? Because we all own the past, and each from our own worldviews. That's a legitimate question, and the answer speaks volumes about our identity. Some of us, progressive scholars, are in this group. We want history to explain in painstaking detail how we arrived at this point in time. In other words, we want to know what happened at Slocum. Others, traditionalists to be precise, want history to celebrate the journey of Anglo men consolidating their gains and protecting them against all comers. Anyway, trouble is, there can be only one guiding narrative, guys. So remember when I referred to the old cliche that says there are two sides to every story? That only signals that it's time to rewrite it. Imagine then, if you will, a timeline of events that notes the milestones in Texas history as a connect the dots view of the past. One where scholars have gone in there and they broke new ground. They're adding a bunch of unfamiliar dots, and you have other scholars like revisionists like me. They're erasing other dots. And so you get to the point where we can no longer connect everything in a way that brings a coherent picture into view. Postmodernism notwithstanding, they need to be reconfigured. Of course, we must place all the dots, the old along the new, with the new in the context of our age. But since neither side is talking to the other, I'd say we got ourselves a good old-fashioned Texas standoff with progressive scholars on one side and traditionalists on the other. So, in that high noon spirit, let's handicap the attributes and debilities of these two gunslingers in our culture war who've been fragging away at each other. We'll see where the holes are. Yet another spoiler alert, most of our holes are self-inflicted. So anyway, the first point, let's talk about the nature of the beast. We'll compare approaches for a second. But on one side, we have traditional Texas history, which is mostly a two-dimensional 19th century narrative story of how Anglo males with conservative inclinations consolidated their gains and protected it against all comers. By nature, it's static. That is, the narrative is mostly unchanging, and in the view of progressives, it kind of reduces history by boiling it down in a way that gives simple explanations for complex conditions and circumstances. As a genre, it's narrowly conceived, and again, I could go on and on, but anyway, for those who are curious about matters of race and gender, the traditional history is kind of tone deaf. It doesn't speak to matters of class at all, because that would start stratifying white folks. There's no way of getting around these basic drawbacks, guys. New books produced by traditionalists are perceived by scholars as best hits of the mid-1800s, but there is intellectual growth because some of the same forces that are shaping scholarship are influencing traditional history as well. What the traditional history does best is that it continues to make sense to its peeps, and that's one thing that progressive scholars can't always claim. But the nature of progressive scholarship, it's multidimensional with the historiography. It's dynamic and it's spanning in every direction. Well, most directions, as we've seen. And it's not just the traditional mind we're not contemplating. We're also failing to see the big picture because our approach is bottoms up. Again, bottoms up. We're looking at history from the bottom. Let me explain. While I was working on this volume, because of my job, I enjoyed the privilege of visiting with many recently minted PhDs from some of the best schools in the country. Few of us are more attuned to the way scholarship is evolving than graduate students learning from the brightest minds in their fields. When the conversation turned to those glacial but inexorable forces of history moving our culture forward, however, they were unfamiliar with the scholarship, and at the time there wasn't just a whole lot of it. But it became clear, though, that they were directing their efforts on significant but narrow topics, leaving them effectively unmindful of recent work that considers those glacial movements of society and its impact on current events. No one would expect a young scholar to possess thorough familiarity with all the intellectual issues that lie beyond their research interests, yet this one in particular reinforced my view that specialized topics and contracted time frames represent the coin of the realm. You might not have gotten this far in the semester yet, but I'll risk ruining something for you to make that point. When I talk about a book that highlighted the work of cigar rolling women during the 1930s, you're going to think that a lot of that rolling came from my eyes, right? But it's just a bait and switch. While they were rolling, someone was reading to them. They went from reading novels to political activism and ended up having a profound influence on integrating Mexican American women into the theater of politics. In any event, though, these kinds of works, narrow topics and contracted time frames, they speak to the main interests of the professors at all these top flight schools. So the natural question arises, what do we lose by failing to assess our common past in the broadest context? And again, what do we lose by failing to back off and just look at the big picture of everything? Because it's something we're not really doing. And I believe that in Texas history, the question will answer itself as I continue handicapping this big Texas standoff. In the meantime, I'm going to give this first one, The Nature of the Beast, to the traditionalists, because what they have done is worked for them for 80 years, and for 30 of them, scholars have been saying it's going away, it's going away. Well, guess what? It's not going away. Anyway, here's the other next point. Where are you getting your Texas history from before you enrolled in this class? I mean, let me put this in perspective for you. For several years, I had the graduate students in my summer classes compile and maintain this annotated bibliography of all the books written about Texas from 2010 to 2018 when I quit teaching graduate students. Their list ended up being more than 400 pages with several books on each page. And I didn't count them all, but it's around 1,500 books. And let me tell you, that's a lot of books about Texas history. So let me ask you guys, all 145 of you, how many of these approximately 1,500 books have you read? See where I'm going with this? I bet it would be noticeably south of 145 books, just saying. You're getting your history from somewhere, and cruel as it sounds, I'd venture some of you aren't getting it at all because it's just not in your wheelhouse, and that's fine. Maybe history will interest you someday. I would venture that many others of you got your Texas history from things you'd see on the web or from news and documentaries, maybe roadside markers, and indirectly from a popular culture that uses stereotypes. No doubt many of you are politically active on both sides. I would hope that something informs your causes. Yet the fact that history is also produced outside of academia has largely been ignored in theories of history. So let's give that one to traditionalists, the one about the, where are you getting your history from? Not from us. Anyway, neither side, this is the next point, neither side in this culture war is pausing to consider the merits of their opponent's view of Texas history. I've already talked about how progressive scholars have invested little energy in understanding the popular mind, nor have we included traditionalists in our conversation. Quite the opposite. Look at it this way. Traditionalists already had their narrative when we came along and began adding new dots and erasing others. We've done that without providing much explanation to those whose dots are disappearing and being minimized. So let's give this one to traditionalists as well and go to the next point, which is closely related. That would be this number 4. So it's 3 out of 3 for the traditionalists. So we've never answered the big burning question that traditionalists have. If it was so good for their fathers and even their great-grandfathers, why is the traditional history all of a sudden a racist and misogynistic myth? Well, actually, we have answered the question in countless micro-histories and case studies produced for enlightened minds, but you have to add them up on your own, which takes a lot of reading and an open mind, which traditionalists are closed to. They're also fond of saying that all our efforts look like unconnected works representing more and more about less and less. You surely heard Michelle beat that drum. For traditionalists, it's an honest response that we have allowed to get vitriolic by not engaging them directly. Instead, scholars and intellectuals have rejoined them, traditionalists, with dismissive contempt. Such open condescension for traditional history, the purest expression of the Anglo-male voice, represents another consequential flaw in an approach to scholarship that professes to be inclusive. Texans who identify with popular culture want an explanation, and I believe that's understandable. Again, let's give this one to the traditionalists, 4 in a row. Now, the intellectual center of gravity. Guys, there's nobody telling us what we have to write about or how we got to approach our topic. Scholars, in theory, are free agents. We're not free agents. But anyway, when you look at the books we've written since 2010, when my graduate students began compiling a Texas bibliography, It's clear that the bulk of scholarly writing focuses on the 19th century, just like the traditional history. I suppose in a field that cannot seem to pull free of its mid-19th century center of gravity, focusing on it so much makes 1836 more relevant to 2036, which is not very distant to a guy like me. Geez, I'm old, but when I think of the time it took me to write this book I'm preaching from here, we don't have a lot of time to pull this off. And hey, the moving targets I was working with weren't stoked by blind passion either. Developing a new usable past that's worthy of informing a collective Texan identity on the occasion of the state's bicentennial should begin with the kind of work that research historians are indeed producing. But it shouldn't end there, guys. Remaining locked in on that mid-1800s center of gravity, even when another century has come and gone, it makes it difficult to refocus the big picture, exposing yet another weakness of scholarship. Hey, it's easy to look at something that's already been in the conversation. It's a lot easier to do that than it is to break new ground in the 20th century, where your sources go in every different direction. And so boom, 5 in a row for tradition as far as the gravity goes. Number 6, social history is out, cultural history is in. You might recall Michelle flashing a slide where she quotes Walter saying that in another 25 years, the well-honed work and up-to-date attitudes will probably be regarded as having antique characteristics. In other words, what she's saying is 25 years ago, that Walter in 1990 was saying that, 25 years ago, who knows, everything he's saying is going to have antique characteristics. Well, I got a news flash for you. That moment has already arrived. It's actually been over 30 years now since publication of the essay Michelle unloaded on Texas History and the Move in the 21st Century, produced by Walter Binger and the late Bob Calvert, who is, by the way, is one of the nicest men in the profession. I would venture that our reluctance to let go of some 1960s era postmodern attitudes that come along with social history represents the singular antique characteristic keeping Texas historians from making more of an impact on their fellow Texans, especially traditionalists who disagree with their political sympathies. So what is cultural history? Well, some scholars study cultures, but what I'm talking about is a cultural approach to studying history. It's different. Think of social history as like this two-dimensional study of social groups on their own merits. Now think of cultural history as something that absorbed it into a 3D world that looks at the same group in the context of the wiggle room they were able to squeeze out of society. What is it all those groups want? More wiggle room. That is, more wiggle room to pursue their own American dreams, both materially and existentially. That grossly oversimplifies everything, but you know what? I can oversimplify it even more so you can appreciate what a huge development this is. Think of social history as focusing narrowly on groups that scholars choose to write about, to the point where many years ago I engaged scholars with degrees in American studies, and it became clear, as some of them readily confided to me, that they didn't really come out of graduate school knowing their American history very well, but they knew their little part of it very well. That's social history, and that doesn't fly anymore. The cultural history we're evolving into demands looking at everything that defines our subject wiggle room in society. It has been responsible for a resurgence of interest in political, military, and economic history that further explains how society treated groups of people. You would think that surely we would factor in the traditional mind and voice, but as we've already established, not so much. And that's one of the two giant postmodern attitudes we need to jettison. The other one is our reluctance to frame this culture war as a contest of meta-narratives, or guiding statements that provide an umbrella for our words and thoughts. So number 6 went to the traditionalists, and I'll tell you, we're talking about the meta-narrative here. I'm going to give that one straight up to traditionalists too. So 7 for 7 here as we go into this one. Have you ever heard the old saying, history is the lie we all agree upon? As cynical as that sounds, writing history is an interpretive endeavor. Since the mid-1930s, our guiding lie, our meta-narrative, is that true Texans wrested the land from the wilderness, the Indians, and the Mexicans. And that fact is not debatable. Even Walter and Michelle agree on it. The state's most prominent traditionalist, a lay historian, first turned that phrase in 1968, unblushingly, I might add. He even doubled down by saying that, quote, to doubt that experience is to question the entire meaning of the true Texan's existence. Well, Walter first emphasized it in 1991 when he assessed the work of his colleagues and found the field influenced disproportionately by fiction and folklore. He concluded, that it was university professors themselves who are mostly responsible for, quote, translating into the official history of Texas what many citizens viewed as the unique experience of Anglo-Saxon males wresting the wilderness from savage Indians and venal Mexicans. He meant that as a kick-me sign. But, and not incidentally, it was a meta-narrative, just saying, and one that traditionalists embraced. By the way, you know what what the kick-me sign is they put on our backs, right? Race, class, and gender. Race, class, and gender. You'll notice it's become race, gender, and victim. There's some layers there too that I'm not going to get into, but that's the one we were wearing on our backs because we don't come up with one of our own. By the way, you know why black folks aren't mentioned in their meta-narrative? You know, wrested the land from the wilderness, the Indians, the Mexicans. Think about it. They were property that white folks brought into Texas with them. And as harsh as it sounds, slavery came with the territory. It was part of what helped true Texans wrest the land from the wilderness. I've already established that our 80-something-year-old meta-narrative is misogynistic, and maybe I haven't yet. But anyway, the same measurement, though, it's racist, too. But let me wager that most of you who might be offended by what I've said there, you know, busting on the traditional history, I bet you've seen that routine Bill Burr did about the guy from Duck Dynasty. And I bet you laughed when he talked about him standing up like the Manchurian Candidate and merely saying something that he was imprinted with. It happens to old people all the time. Doesn't have to mean much, guys. But anyway, this meta-narrative is a lot older than he is, too, about the wilderness, the Indians, the Mexicans. And remember me saying that progressive historians don't have a meta-narrative? Here, then, is the other fundamental area where Walter and I disagree, and it regards the very approaches that we take to Texas history. Now, I framed everything as a stalemate between traditionalists and scholars, you know, as a contest of meta-narratives. Walter's told me several times that the approach was overly complicated and stilted. I disagree. As Walter has heard me say, it's an easy concept to understand if you don't take a principled stand not to understand it. I'm not saying that Walter's having trouble wrapping his mind around it. He understands what I'm saying. What I mean is that it violates that having a meta-narrative violates that basic postmodern principle of meta-narratives being mere products of power and force of language. Therefore, we shouldn't take meta-narratives seriously, and he is determined not to. I would contend now that because of our polarization as Texans and Americans, the concept of a meta-narrative is a lot easier to understand for the simple reason that it does its job. Just as important, it's part of a cultural history approach that I said is more concerned with making progress than with jumping through ideological hoops. Folks, all a meta-narrative does is answer the question, what does it all mean? That is, you take all these little pieces that seem to be speaking the same language or trope, and you explain in one pop what all of them are trying to say. What's the New Testament trying to say? Here's a hint. You know, when you saw Tim Tebow and he wears little things under his eyes, and it said John 3:16 or whatever, there you go. You got it. That's the meta-narrative for the New Testament. What has feminists so riled up? Systems of patriarchy have conspired to keep women down. I chose that as an example because traditional Texas history is one of those systems of patriarchy keeping women down. Now, if you're an American Western historian, you should be able to recite Turner's thesis without hesitation. The existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, the advancement of American settlement west explains American development. And you know, guys, like some of the people who were in my classes long ago, I didn't have the answer written on my palm there. So I was trained as a Western historian, by the way. But Turner's thesis, it's actually a meta-narrative. It's over 125 years old. And eggheads have been jackhammering on that rock for as long as I've been in the profession. I took a few whacks at it myself when I took a chapter to deconstruct the way regional history treats Texas. They don't treat us well. So let me ask you a rhetorical question. Do you really think Western historians would still be beating up on the guy if all he did was give him little pieces of his work? You know, here's 1,000 different things I'm working on. So where am I going with all this? That's all a meta-narrative is, guys. It's a thesis, although the term has taken on some weight since 1893 and it needs to be called a grand thesis. It's also been called a master narrative, whatever. You know, I spun the wheel and I chose the word meta-narrative. It's not the word that's giving Walter pause anyway. It's the concept that one statement can represent the glue that holds everything together. I'll give my own grand thesis in a minute. You know, I'm going to belabor the point with my barbecue analogy because there's no mistaking what a meta-narrative is, and I give this one. It always worked best on my 6 p.m. classes at the Woodland Center because most of the students were rushing to class in traffic, and I'd start talking about barbecue and just torture them. But all right, so say you're hungry, you're walking down the street, and you look up and you see a sign. It has 3 little letters on it. It says BBQ. Well, even before walking inside that door, those 3 simple letters are going to tell you that you're going to encounter tater salad, coleslaw, jalapenos, or pecos strawberries if you're not into the whole brevity thing there. But there's probably going to be some nanner pudding too, and for sure pecan pie. And it is pecan, by the way. Pecan is what Yankees and your old grandpappy used to, what your grandpappy used to do is too cold to walk to the outhouse. Okay, I got a shot in there. Sorry, guys. But and Paul, and let me get back to the barbecue though. The tall, bottomless glasses of iced tea. I mean, gosh, all these things aren't burnt carcinogenic meat, but you fully expect to see them because they're all part of the barbecue experience. They come with the territory. So this takes us back to Slocum and that line about blackmail by shame. Hopefully you read the other assignment, the article from the Texas Observer called Where the Bodies Are Buried by Michael Barajas. For those of you who haven't put an eyeball to it, the article is about the controversy that unfolded over a historical marker at Slocum in East Texas. By the way, my peeps, we're coming up on the 1 hour mark here. I'll wrap this up in a few minutes, I promise. But anyway, back in 1910, there was a racial purge in that little town where mobs of white people murdered as many as 50 black people. And over the years, white folks in that area forgot about it. And when it was brought up, they were inclined to deny that it ever happened. So along comes the great-great-granddaughter of a man who had endured slavery and settled in Slocum only to end up having to flee for his life. When the woman applied for a historical marker honoring the victims of this pogrom, local leaders called the idea inappropriate, dishonorable, and blackmail by shame. If you don't know how the traditional mind processes history, it's a jaw-dropping WTF moment. If you do know how the traditional mind processes Texas history, that's a perfectly understandable response. If your meta-narrative says that true Texans wrested the land from the wilderness, the Indians, and the Mexicans, then you'd expect these little messes like Slocum to pop up here and there. But they're incidental to that meta-narrative, and talking about them diminishes that triumphal story. By the way, to me, that's just a knee-jerk reaction, just like the one I experienced in West Texas. Something I didn't tell you, those dear people out there in West Texas, they later invited me to a public roundtable, and they commemorated their history and their identity. And anyway, we agreed there were areas that we're just going to have some honest tension here. I said, guys, it's a good thing because, we can't always see eye to eye, but we can appreciate that we have our own self-interests and that we pursue them differently. Sometimes our self-interest can be one and the same. It's kind of cool. Later, one of those guys, a rancher out there, called on me to testify about the importance of a historical site on his land, and he won. It wasn't gunfights and donkey riding contests or whatever that I talked about. It was what really happened there. So let me double down on a point I've already made. It might take a while, but one day perhaps the people in Slocum will understand that the truth, the full story, makes their own existence on the land more important. They might not sit around singing Kumbaya, but maybe it'll help both sides reconcile a history that glorifies the Anglo experience with that of those who were othered out by it. Getting there should be a shared responsibility for progressives and traditionalists. I mean, look at it this way. Without us having a meta-narrative or a grand thesis, traditionalists are over there sitting at the barbecue joint, and all they see are a bunch of feminists, radicals, and freaks, and dark-skinned people, and they all look agitated about something. They're all going inside a building with no sign over the door. My gosh, for a bunch of people who spent the 1950s seeing communists behind every tree, that's got to be alarming to their unrestrained imagination. So, in the spirit of handicapping this horse race, you've already heard me give you the perspective of epochal change, which I contend has created a tectonic break in society. On one side, you have traditionalists. They're very sure of their ways and their values, and they have a history that speaks to them. On the other side, you have folks who have drifted in as many directions as you have groups. They're all in search of common ways and values, yet the history that speaks to them does not have a meta-narrative, a sign over the door to put all those groups together. So let me give you a meta-narrative or a grand thesis that helped me make sense of the relationship between history and current events. Here it is. You're going to have to wrap your mind. I wish you could see it up on the screen here, but it says, Texans in pursuit of self-interest, viewed alongside the ascendancy of Anglo-male hegemony and challenges to its authority, a tenant in the cycles of the state's development, explains the history of Texas. Let me break that down. When I say Texans, I'm talking about, Texans in pursuit of self-interest. So I'm talking about all Texans, regardless of which side you're on the culture war. And this thing, it is cast as a tug of war between the self-titled true Texans and everyone else. But it doesn't have to diminish the traditional view. It can make it part of a new usable past that's truthful and one that's capable of projecting their ways, values, and identities. So when I say that, it's like when I'm talking about the authorities attendant in the cycles of the state's development, think of every chapter that you have. And, it's every chapter's some other way of resisting authority. But it also moves the, think about it. Right now, you've got two sides with this us versus them attitude. And they're fighting over exclusive rights to tell the story of our Texas past. But by looking at how all Texans pursued their self-interests, it can remove that us versus them out of the equation. And guys, don't underestimate, that's incredibly important. And again, by looking at this, not us versus them, but it also moves the center of gravity out of the revolution and the frontier, which, as I noted, is holding us back as the bicentennial of Texas independence grows closer every year. Plus, let me ask you, just who is us and who is them? I mean, this meta-narrative envisions Texas as a community of interconnected, competing cultures. They don't stay the same. Cultures are dynamic, guys. Think of Venn diagrams, all the little circles that overlap each other. Our self-interests are always in motion because they're never completely static. And we can understand the self-interests of Texans only by gaining appreciation for the historical forces that have formed and reconfigured the relationships among them, or how they fit in those little Venn diagrams. But before this kind of history evolves into a usable past that gains traction among traditionalists, it must first gain traction among scholars, and I'm not holding my breath. Michelle made it sound like Walter issued some edict back in 1990, and everyone started scrambling to make it happen. And I probably made it sound like that too, but it didn't unfold like that, guys. It took years for that attitude about social history to filter up through the ranks, and sometimes it's still hard to tell where the popular culture ends and scholarship begins. So now, as we start doing cultural history, you're still going to have people doing traditional history and then social history on top of it. And guys, in a contest of meta-narratives where only one side has articulated its worldview, that already presents an uneven match, and we don't have one. Added to this considerable advantage, the traditional past, it's further strengthened by such assets as simplicity, tradition itself, and imprinting Texas history in the 4th grade and inculcating it in the 7th grade. They also have the neatly packaged moral instruction of a teleological past. That's another way of saying that traditionalists factor in God's plan for them. And I'm not saying that scholars are ungodly. I go to church, geesh. And notably, being oblivious to the silent hand of a power elite that even scholars pay a little attention to. So, traditionalists have some drawbacks too. But given these realities, for research historians engaged in a culture war to continue willfully avoiding the very instinctively logical exercise of composing a grand thesis for pulling all their work together, it makes no practical sense. And again, it's got us to this point, I think, where we are now, are partly responsible for it. But there's a twin certainty that we're going to have to deal with that stands in the way of a grand thesis that would appeal to all Texans. The first certainty is that a meta-narrative that flows from true Texans wresting the land from the wilderness, the Indians, the Mexicans, that's not going to fly. I mean, intellectually speaking, it's as dead as social history. Of course, neither of these zombies are reading their obituaries, and that's a root cause of our big Texas standoff. The second certainty is that a progressive narrative going sans meta in 1,000 different directions at once, which fails to contemplate the experience of Anglo-Texan males and their worldviews, again, will be as big a whopper as the great white lie it proposes to replace. End of story. Guess I'm repeating myself, but it's a point worth repeating, and it's time to turn the corner, folks. It's going to take both sides to do it. Personally, I don't see that happening anytime soon because we're letting our emotions cloud our thoughts. I mean, you have people on both sides with these rigid views, and the culture war is only pushing them farther into their own corners. But it's always worth a try. But thank you for listening. I hope that you can think about some of these things and know a little bit more about how history happens and how it has intersected with this moment in time. So thank you for listening, guys. It's also time to sign off, and look for your information on Blackboard that tells you the directions for your writing assignment. And as always, but for the last time in my career, smert bishim hovno hlabim.